You're listening to Ecosysteming, the podcast redefining economic development through the lens of equitable entrepreneurship, 2 decades in the making. Join NC Idea's Tom Rue as he engages with entrepreneurs and experts who are challenging the status quo and driving lasting change.
Hello, and welcome listeners of the Ecosysteming podcast. I am your host, Tom Rue, and today I am joined by Dr. Nathan Goldschlag, who is Director of Research at the Economic Innovation Group, or EIG, as they are affectionately known around this office. And EIG is a bipartisan public policy org that produces, and I can say this sincerely from firsthand practice, nationally recognized research. And they work with policymakers to develop ideas to impact smarter policy that empowers workers, entrepreneurs, and strengthens our communities. Dr. Goldschlag, welcome and thank you for joining us on the Ecosysteming podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here. I spent a lot of my career thinking about entrepreneurship, and so really happy to talk to some people that think about it as much as I do.
Oh yeah, it's always fun to talk to kindred spirits, right? I mean, it's kind of what we do, and it's what gets me out of bed in the morning. I think it's I'm at that age now. I just had the last birthday I'm going to recognize, which was 59. I plan to be 59 for several more years.
Okay.
And so invariably, some people are starting to ask like, hey, the big R word, right? Retirement.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, first of all, I feel way too young for that, but I love what I do, and I don't golf. My only vice is fishing, and you can only fish for so much. So I hope that this will be something that'll be occupying me for many more years to come. But what makes this work better, easier, more impactful is having organizations like yours that put the data out there in practical ways to inform policy debate and discussion, and in a way that transcends what is at the moment the very tribal nature, of this kind of work. Why don't we give you the courtesy of giving the better introduction of EIG? I just shortcutted through the boilerplate on the website, but why don't you, in your own words, tell us first a little bit about EIG, and then we'll dig in a little deeper.
Yeah, so we're a bipartisan think tank. We spend a lot of time thinking about and doing research on business dynamism, innovation, technological change, and distressed communities and the economic geography. And so we write research that informs our policy proposals, and then we work to make those policies a reality. I think one of our sort of cornerstone pieces of legislation and policy and research has been around opportunity zones, which was actually the impetus for the creation of EIG. And so that proposal creates special tax incentives for distressed communities. It was actually recently made permanent in the Big Beautiful Bill, tax bill. So it was originally introduced in the 2017 tax bill, and then it was made permanent just recently. And that's an example of sort of a market-oriented approach to thinking about dynamism and distressed communities, and how we can make communities better off through harnessing the powers of the market and entrepreneurship and business dynamism.
I'm going to try to be a good host and ask certain questions that listeners might be having. And since I have to be their proxy and their voice in these, let me start with, can you go a little deeper on opportunity zones? I know it's a word that everybody's heard 1,000 times if you've ever listened to NPR or other outlets, but what really is an opportunity zone, and why do people need to care about this?
So opportunity zones are tracts that are designated, or small geographic units that are designated by states that are designated by state governors as recognized as an opportunity zone. And once a geography is recognized as an opportunity zone, then investors can roll in capital gains from other investments. They can roll capital gains investments into those communities and have preferential tax treatment of those gains. So it's a way to funnel capital into distressed communities in order to make investments in infrastructure and housing and new businesses. Recently, my colleagues at EIG published a research paper that showed that opportunity zones had a significant increase in the housing stock. Right. So one of the ways that opportunity zones have been used is capital flows in through this preferential tax treatment and is used to create new housing stock. And so if you look at designated opportunity zones, these distressed communities that were designated as opportunity zones, and compare them to similar low income communities that were not designated, we saw a statistically significant increase in the housing stock due to that designation. But there, housing is one of the use cases for opportunity zones. But generally, you should think about it as a policy for incentivizing capital to flow towards distressed communities. So yeah, opportunity zones are a way for those capital gains to flow into designated opportunity funds, and that defers the tax payment on those gains. So investors can roll the capital that they've accumulated through capital gains into these funds and then invest them in these distressed communities and defer the tax payment, depending on the types of investments they make and how long they hold them.
So, right to assume the fact that they've been made now permanent, um, early returns are very favorable. I mean, you mentioned that if you have the control community that didn't have an opportunity zone, the ones with have been significantly outperforming.
Yeah, in the case of housing, and our research was one of several papers that found this sort of effect. I think in the case of housing, it's very clear that and which is housing is an important sort of precursor to other types of development, right? So you can think of it as sort of an upstream type of infrastructure investment. The creation of new housing would be upstream of the alleviation of some other types of ailments of poverty or distressed communities. So I think it's really important that it's having that effect, and it definitely clearly is.
Very cool. Let's talk about distressed communities for a minute. I think this is your first of several data sets. I mean, the business dynamism, by virtue of what we do, is right in our sweet spot, of course. But to me, the Distressed Communities Index database is such a useful tool, and I can't imagine not being conversant with it if I was a policymaker, if I was an elected official. And I'll tell you, for better or worse, the way I've used it, and I've referenced EIG data in keynotes that I've given. One of the most curious exercises I've done with it is you can look at a map and your data visualization is fantastic. I mean, you can pick by county, by zip code. And the last time I checked, so I'm going to give myself an out here, in North Carolina, I think there were 5 shared borders where there was a top quintile county sharing a border with a bottom quintile county. And the argument, all mine, so I'm not going to drag you down with my, uh, lizard brain way of working, but I look at that and I say, how different are the lives lived by people that share a border, right? You have the most affluent, the most worry free, in the sense that like we're doing just fine, sharing a border with county where people, disproportionately living at or below, certain wage and living standards, where life is a struggle. And how do you, if your job is economic development, if your job is, good legislation, how do you not reconcile that and like let that be the impetus and motivation for doing something?
Yeah, that's right. I think the way I think about this is through the lens of, so there's like something like a decade of economic research on sort of the importance of neighborhoods. Raj Chetty, he's a researcher at Harvard. He spent a lot of time explaining to us the importance of neighborhoods and how a zip code could sort of have a determinative effect on the outcomes of children that grow up in them. And interestingly, the way that he sort of catches this stuff is by thinking about the flow of kids into neighborhoods. And within a family, maybe you've got a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old, that gives you some variation in how long the kid lives in that zip code, right? And so from that, we learned the very significant impact a place can have on outcomes. I think we are currently still learning about why that is. What is it? What's the mechanism that drives the causal link of a specific place to child outcomes, long run outcomes, intergenerational mobility? But it looks like one of the important determinants is employment rates among adults in that neighborhood. And so, one of the ways to sort of pull distressed communities out of those situations seems like employment rates among adults are going to be an important lever for that sort of thing. And that's where something like opportunity zones, where you're incentivizing the flow of capital. Some of that capital might be used to create new businesses, and those new businesses might create additional employment opportunities. Like that's the type of thing that we're thinking about as well. But in terms of like the discontinuity of one neighborhood that's doing very well, backed right up against a neighborhood that's doing very poorly. Sometimes those boundaries are much more continuous, and sometimes it's actually a railroad that runs between them. And in that case, it actually is a sharp uh, uh, gap between them. We just actually published the most recent version of the Distressed Communities Index last week. I think it came out. Kenan, our senior fellow, Kenan Fikri, wrote up a nice Substack post about some of the findings from this most recent tranche of data. And that analysis stressed the gap between suburban geographies and urban and rural geographies, and the share of prosperous places that are suburban, and then the share of suburban places that are prosperous is very high compared to urban and rural. And so it's sort of like when you try to think about what types of geographies are doing well, it tends to be the suburban areas.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me in the least based upon our own, lived experience with the work we do. You said something just a couple minutes ago about increasing the employment rates, in these communities. And I think you might have inferred that new firm formation might be useful for increasing employment opportunity. Am I making a stretch here in inferring that? He said with a stupid grin on his face.
No, no, no. Startups are an incredibly important way that economies change over time. Uh, Entrance and new firm formation is a very important engine of job growth. The disproportionate share of overall job creation is created by young firms. Like this is a part of the economics literature that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and writing in. And so, yes, I think startups are a really key and important ingredient to how communities can adapt and change over time, because when there are big changes to demand or technology, new innovations, new products, it tends to be younger firms that step in to implement those changes and reflect those changes in the economy. It's also how an important way that labor and capital gets reallocated between different types of tasks. And I think one of you may already be familiar with this, but maybe your listeners aren't. One of the big mysteries in this literature, and like the economists that are thinking about business dynamism, is that it had been falling for something like 30 years. In the mid 1980s, the share of the startup rate, so it's the share of all businesses that were newly born, something like 13%, that fell to less than 10% or less than 8% by 2010, right? So it fell quite a bit over time. And then it was sort of inching up in the 2010s, but still climbing very slowly until we hit COVID, where we saw a huge surge in entrepreneurship. And so, in the case of North Carolina, for any of your North Carolina listeners, the trend in North Carolina and the startup rate basically maps to the full U.S. startup rate trend pretty closely. So when you look at how the startup rate has changed in North Carolina over time, looks a lot like the rest of the economy, something like 13, 14% in the mid 1980s, falling down to a little bit under 8% in the 2010s, and then creeping up to about 9% by 2022.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. I have this on my desk. This is the startup rates for the state of North Carolina for the last several years. And yes, the big jump, starting in 2019, just over 100,000 startups in the state of North Carolina. 2020, that obviously asterisked year, was 126. So going into COVID, we were already starting to climb up. And then 2021 was the biggest spike. It hit 178, 291. 2022, 171 and change. 2023, 171 and change. And last year, 162. So down a little bit, but these are still very respectable numbers. So when we think about the COVID bump, if I could use that term, I think we're starting to, I'm not a PhD like you, so I will just use my simple educational background and say, I think we're starting to sustain beyond the COVID bump.
That's right. And so I know that I'm on the right sort of podcast because you've got a notepad full of startup rates. That's a good sign. So yeah, so I think the surge of entrepreneurship that we experienced during COVID, it was actually first showed up in administrative records on applications to form a new business. So when somebody wants to start an employer business, in order to file 941 or 943 payroll taxes, you need an employer identification number or an EIN. And so that to get an EIN, you've got to submit some paperwork to the IRS that says sort of like your name of your business, the types of things that you want to do, and why you're getting the EIN. It also, interestingly, it has some information about whether or not you expect to hire employees. And so those EIN applications actually flowed through to the Census Bureau, which is my former employer, where I did a lot of my research on business dynamism. And so researchers at the Census Bureau took those applications, tried to figure out which ones were likely to become employers, and then counted them up. And what we saw in post-COVID period was a very sharp decrease in applications that then surged way above where it was in 2019. And that prompted a lot of speculation among the research community, sort of what's happening here? Why is this happening? Is it real? It could have been a lot of sort of gig economy type activity, Amazon, third party sellers, a lot of people stuck at home during COVID, starting an Etsy shop or something. So there was a lot of like ho humming about whether or not this is sort of real entrepreneurship. But I think what we've learned over the past 5 years is that yes, it was real. There's a lot of slower data sources that take a bit more time that are based on payroll tax records or unemployment insurance records, administrative data at the state level. So in those different types of sources, which are much higher quality, but do come with a lag, they've started to show this sort of post-COVID surge in entrepreneurship and employer businesses that are coming through, and not just in certain types of sectors. It's sort of a broad phenomena across different types of sectors. You had increases in construction, retail, professional services, scientific services. So it's sort of there was a surge in entrepreneurship across a bunch of different sectors all at once. So I think what we've learned is that yes, this is a real thing. It created real businesses and real jobs, and it's actually still going, right? So, and in the case of North Carolina, so the U.S. overall surge in business applications through these EIN applications data that I was talking about was about 40, 50%, or about 40% over during like the 2022, 2023 period over its 2019 levels, about a 40% increase. North Carolina, we saw about a 50%. So the surge in North Carolina in applications is actually a little bit stronger than it was for sort of the economy overall. Uh, and there was this thought. My friend and co-author John Haltewanger and Brian Decker have done a lot of research on these things. There was this period in late 23 where it started to come down, and people were thinking, oh, maybe this is going to cool and recede, but actually it's sort of continued robustly through 2025.
Yeah, there's this little thing called AI, I think, that kind of
That's
said
right.
to COVID, hold my beer, I'll take it from here. And we see that going. Before we jump into it, because I know you're going to have a few things to say about AI, I just want to brag on you one more time, in not only the work that you do at EIG, but in your previous role as the principal economist at the U.S. Census Bureau's Center for Economic Studies, where you led research conducting firm dynamics, technology, and labor markets. That data, those data sources, and what you have put out through there, equally important to anybody in this space, right? You do not have to put programs out in the field on a hope that it's going to address a market. There are organizations like your current and your previous that are putting data out there to inform priorities and inform programmatically what we might be doing and how we should, deploy our resources, our time, treasure, and talent, so to speak. So I wanted to acknowledge that work because it's always been a great body of work and desperately needed. Frankly, I'm surprised there isn't greater emphasis on it. Here in the state of North Carolina, recently, last year, this for some reason startups, and I don't understand this, they go through the Secretary of State's office in North Carolina, not the Commerce Department. So our Secretary of State last year, they commissioned a study and they interviewed over 6,000 nascent firms. So people, I think 5 years and younger. And they asked for all kinds of economic indicators like, what is self-sufficiency for you, right? And the general norm was to hit 100,000 in ARR or more, and then we'd be at self-sufficient. So they broke down this analysis, and the report came out, and I called it the silent bomb. I thought it was just hugely significant to, frankly, challenge every economic development priority we have, but nobody heard it. It's like nobody paid attention to it because the findings of that study said if we helped only 5% of nascent firms, 5 years old or younger, get up to that self-sufficient mark that they self-identified as 100,000. So just 5% growth from 50 to 100. We'd create over 24,500 more jobs, and the economic impact of the state year one would be somewhere between 1.5 and $2 billion. Yeah, I look at that and I think about these big smokestack chasing deals where we throw hundreds of millions, of tax incentives at some large company, it comes at a net loss in most cases. If it's a move, right, as opposed to a new firm. So if it's a move, it comes at the expense of whatever state they're going to move from to come here. And if you just look at what we're willing to put out there in incentives for those promises, where I know it's academically not sound, but I still do it anyhow. The cost per job. So I take the value of the incentive package and I divide it by the number of jobs promised. And then, these numbers are routinely 50, 60, 80. I think one of the most egregious I saw was like $140,000, of incentives per job promised. Yet we've got this job creation engine hiding in plain sight. It's not sexy. There aren't big press briefing opportunities. Governors don't do ribbon cuttings for, hey, we helped Ajax LLC go from 6 employees to 26 employees.
Mm-hmm.
But in aggregate, it's a huge number.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So it is true. Yeah. As I said, like young firms are disproportionately creating jobs. I think that the tough part is that it's often hard to know which young firms are going to grow and succeed. Um, the outcomes of young firms are very skewed. So a very small sort of one of the ways that we describe this in the economics profession is it's an up or out phenomenon. So most young firms fail, and I think it's something like 50% of young firms exit by 5 years. So most young firms fail, and then a small subset grow rapidly and create a lot of jobs. And at the outset, sort of at the filing or at age zero, it's often very difficult to determine
Right.
what type a firm is. So I think in terms of like advantaging that activity, sort of leveraging that activity to create additional jobs and dynamism and reallocation, it's a lot of that is going to come down to the availability of capital and making sure that when people do have good ideas, and when talented individuals want to enter into entrepreneurship, that they have the pathways available to them to do that.
Yeah, that's truer words, right? Now, but here's a question for you. And I know historically that's kind of been the case, but there is of late, and I'm now pivoting to the topic I promised we would dive into. There's a lot of concern that AI, whereas enabling, so there's like new market entry opportunities solely powered by what AI can do now. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, if you were going to start a company, an MVP would cost you $500,000 to produce. And now with a couple $20 a month subscriptions, you don't even have to have coders, create an MVP, which again, on one side is a positive thing, but on the employment side, not so positive. Why don't I just tee up broadly AI and then we can dig deeper, based upon where you want to go with that? Like, what are you seeing from the data standpoint of what AI is doing?
Yeah, this is a super interesting and fast moving topic. One of the things I really enjoy about it is the diversity of people that are engaged in it. Um, you get like the full spectrum from AI doomers that they call it P doom or probability of doom, where they're considering these scenarios where AI takes over the world and we all get turned into paper clips, to sort of writing it off as sort of a relatively banal innovation and technology that's like the internet will burn in over time, but may not have dramatic effects. Um, I've been engaged in this since I've been at the Census Bureau as well. We wrote a lot of survey questions to try to ask businesses whether or not they used AI, how AI affected their demand for workers, their demand for skill. And there's a couple surprising facts that people might not know. One is that the diffusion of AI is actually much lower on the firm side than some people might think based on the headlines. It's still the case that even I think as of June of 2025, only about 9%, so less than 10% of businesses say that they use AI in the production of goods and services.
Wow.
Now, the production of goods and the way that that question is worded, production of goods and services, maybe that's a little stringent, right? And depending on how firms are interpreting that question, if the firm might be using AI to develop a couple pieces of marketing material, would they respond yes to production of goods and services? Maybe, maybe not. So it's maybe a sort of a stringent uh, requirement, but it's also in the production of goods and services where we think of those big productivity impacts that are actually going to create economic growth. That's probably where it'll start showing up first. Now, that 9% number underneath that, it varies a lot by sector. So in the information sector, where sort of the Googles and Metas are, that's something like 20, 25 or 30%, I think now. So it varies a lot by industry, but it's either way, I think the 9% number people sometimes find a little shocking. The other thing that we found in those surveys is when we asked firms how they changed their employment due to the use of AI, the vast majority said it didn't really change much at all. There was no change. But then among the that's like something like 95% said no change. But among the small subset that said that it would, about as many said increase as decrease. So the initial firm level evidence that we have sort of is questioning the big employment impacts of AI. And when we were asking these questions about 6 months in the future, something like 6% said increase employment, 6% said decrease among the ones that you said that we were going to be that were using AI.
That is the first time I'm hearing
Yeah.
increase employment.
So yeah. I mean, so what one of the things that a technology like AI can do is it can make workers more productive. If
Right.
workers are more productive, you might demand more of them, not less. Right. So there's sort of an augmentation effect of AI, and then there's sort of the substitution effect of AI. Now, one of the things that pops out of these surveys is that a very significant portion of firms, something like I think 30%, say that it will automate some tasks that workers do. So my view, based on the survey data, is that AI is going to have a significant effect in reshuffling the types of tasks that workers are going to be doing. And I think there's going to be a subset of occupations where the mix of tasks is so heavily skewed towards automation that that employment does contract. Like it's easy to see that in the case of maybe customer service representatives or something like that, you might have AI do almost all of the tasks. Even there, it might be that the firm finds other ways or other complementary or new tasks that those workers can do instead of being entirely displaced. But there might be narrow occupations where there is much more automation than augmentation. But I think on average, I expect that there'll be some reshuffling of tasks.
That's interesting. I like the spectrum, right? The doomers to the it's a fad spectrum and people in between. I was recently at a dinner where we were talking about that, and it was the opinion of somebody at the dinner that and he was very bullish on AI, like he's welcoming this, but that it's going to be the, cause of double digit unemployment. And if we are going to stave off the civil war, AI will be, see if you can follow this chain of logic, that AI will be the catalyst that brings the US into UBI. And it's like, it's just going to be mandated because when we have 15, 16, 17% unemployment, because AI has displaced so many jobs that like we're going to have to keep the masses, placid by offering UBI. And this was coming from somebody that I understand to be politically on the far right, which my brain couldn't reconcile that. I was like, um,
Yeah, the AI discussion is kind of scrambling some of the traditional lines of political thought. I've seen this sort of description of UBI as well, because if if there's this sort of massive unemployment, and then all of this excess gains captured by owners of capital, you have this reallocation regime to sort of spread the gains from the technology. Uh, you know, One thing that I see a lot of people doing is not really engaging deeply with sort of the history of technology and technological change.
yeah.
Uh, and I'm open to the idea that, look, this time is just different. This AI is going to be the evolution of AI as a technology, and its impact on the economy is going to be different than, let's say, electricity or or running water or any of these other sort of big digital technologies, big transformational changes. That I'm okay with that, but I think you do have to contend with the fact that even for something like the internet and digitization, these things took a long time to integrate with the in the economy. It takes firms a long time to figure out how to use those technologies to produce new goods and services. And if that happens over a relatively long period, then that also means that labor has a chance to reallocate and invest in different types of skills and find different tasks, find different occupations. Like, then this is where the dynamism comes in, right? This is where the entrants come in to produce, pick up different types of labor that was displaced by this new technology, and engage with that labor in some other and more productive way.
Well, Dr. Goldschlag, Christian has given me the hook. We got to wrap this, but I can't let this podcast end without asking you, the question here, and that is really, as from your very informed standpoint, the research you've done extensively in your previous job and currently at EIG, what is the greatest, either known or unknown opportunity with entrepreneurship is a way to really rethink, recast economic development? If you had the magic wand to make it so, what would be your, instruction in that?
So I think about this question in terms of how we think about the explanation for why it fell for 30 years. And the way that I think about that is sort of, it's a death by a thousand cuts kind of story. Uh, and there's explanations that are related to declining, to demographic change, sort of aging of the population. There's explanations about increasing market share of incumbent firms, additional frictions in the system. And one of the things that my co-author Alex Tabarrok and I looked at was federal regulations. In, in fact, we found that we could not find a relationship between federal regulation and the decline in entrepreneurship and startups. We thought it was a good place to look. But it turns out, industries that saw dramatic increases in regulations also saw, and industries that saw only relatively modest increase in regulations both saw declining dynamisms. There wasn't much of a relationship there. But I think the way that I think about why it declined was sort of, lots of these little things add up. And so in order to sort of increase entrepreneurship uh, and dynamism in the economy, it's sort of like a yes and approach. Things like occupational licensing, that increase the barriers to entry. Things like non-competes. So EIG has spent a lot of time talking about banning non-competes and thinking about making it easier for high-skilled immigrants to start businesses. So if we have these super talented people that we decide that we want to come to the country to this country, uh, right now their visa status is very heavily tied to their employer, makes it very hard for them to change jobs, but also to start a new business. So if you have this really talented person that we decided we want to be in this country, we should also let them start a business that would employ U.S. workers.
Wait a minute. Stop the presses. Are you suggesting that immigration is a net positive to the U.S. economy?
I'm saying that high-skilled
What?
immigrants start businesses at a higher rate than native-born workers, and if they happen to want to create a business and they're super talented individuals, we should make it easier, not harder, for them to do that. Uh, so I think it's and then you sort of have a bunch of upstream things like science funding for science and basic research. Sort of there's a very important channel through which entrepreneurs introduce new products, and that through like commercialization of new technologies. And sort of the research triangle is a great example of this, where you have sort of these agglomeration effects of this basic research, scientific talent, and then entrepreneurial talent and capital. Sort of when you mix all those things into one pot, you can kind of jumpstart the innovative, high growth startup ecosystem, if you will.
Yeah, I remember at a previous place that I worked, we did a lot of this research, you know, uh, cribbing from y'all and others. And I remember one report we put out back in the day that said it was like 25 to 30% of the Fortune 500 companies had an immigrant CEO or founder. And, you think about what the Fortune 500 companies do from a GDP standpoint and realize that, more than a quarter of them are led by immigrant entrepreneurs. You can just very quickly understand the net benefit of that. But it's always nice when somebody that's got the receipts can state that definitively. So, you know, Dr. Goldschlag, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. I hope it's the beginning of more such conversations. If we can ever be a test subject for your work at EIG here in the state of North Carolina, please let us know. We like to eat our own dog food, as we say, and be very entrepreneurial about the approach to our work and our portfolio. We are not adverse to doing some experimentation and figuring out stuff that works and the things that don't, so that we can avoid that in the future and share it with others. So once again, thank you so much. And I hope to talk to you again very soon.
Thank you, Tom. This was a lot of fun. To find somebody that thinks about entrepreneurship and dynamism as much as we do, it's a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Stay connected with NC Idea on LinkedIn and Facebook, and subscribe to our newsletter for all the latest as we celebrate our 20th year. Catch new episodes of Ecosysteming every other Tuesday. Thanks for tuning in and being a part of this thing of ours.